Hello, welcome to the next in our series of studies on this very warm afternoon. We've been looking over several weeks now about how we got to know the story of Jesus Christ. We acknowledged that, whilst you could say it's in the Bible, we've considered how we got the Bible, why the Bible took the shape it took. We've also looked at the history of 2,000 years of Christianity and seen how division in the search for truth led to great difficulties. All very sad when it began with a man who said, "Love one another." Last week we had a particular look at one aspect of church which involves us, the Baptists. Today, however, I want to finish on a note of hope. We give it a posh name, the ecumenical movement. But it's the way in which churches started to realise and find ways to love one another again.
Generally, historians consider 1910 was the start of the modern ecumenical movement, with the Council for World Mission that met in Edinburgh. But it goes back quite a long way earlier. In fact, Constantine the Great, who was a convert to Christianity, set up an ecumenical council. It was based in Nicaea in the year 325 AD, and he was hoping that this was a way in which the already occurring divisions in the church could be stopped by unifying the creeds, for example, and by determining what scripture was. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out, and so we have a very interesting situation, because what he did was that those who disagreed with what the ecumenical council said, he banned. And of course, we've seen how the next 1600 years were full of divisions. But particularly through the Victorian period, we have the start of things which suggest that Christians should be working together. One of the earliest forerunners of this was the YMCA in 1844, the Young Men's Christian Association, followed by the Young Women's Christian Association 11 years later in 1855. And indeed, the Student Christian Federation began in 1895. But go back to the campaign against slavery, and those who worked for its abolition were also Christians from different traditions. Anglicans and Baptists, we know, worked together very closely. So, yes, there was a sign that people ought to be working together. But the 1910 Edinburgh Council was huge. There had been earlier conferences. There had been one in London in 1888 and another one in Liverpool in 1860 before that. And in New York there was a similar sort of meeting in 1900, but 1910 was the biggie. It was an invitation for Protestants, and 1,215 representatives were called, although they were pretty much exclusively from the West, and there were no Catholics or Orthodox Christians invited. But the really interesting thing is that they saw their job was to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, try to avoid the duplication in different countries overseas, so that resources weren't being wasted. And they spent more time talking about mission than trying to discuss the niceties of theology. It was, if you like, institutional cooperation. So different missionary societies would agree which parts of the world in which they would be working. And in many ways, it did achieve quite a lot. But not long after the conference, World War I broke out.
And in the aftermath it was seen that these were Christian nations fighting against each other. And so much of what had come out of the 1910 conference was seen that Western civilization was the embodiment of Christianity. And the World War I experience proved that that was not to be the case. The next ecumenical conference took place in Jerusalem in 1928. And over the years since, there's been a growing awareness of a number of things that had to change. That it was important that representatives from all around the world were involved, that Christianity was a global faith, not just a Western one. There was a recognition that it was multicultural, multiracial, and had implications implications because the world was multi-religious. In 1948, the World Council of Churches was formed, and again, increasing understanding of the nature of Christian mission. In the 1970s, the Catholics became involved when a papal legate was sent along. I suppose you could describe it as an observer role, but things were gradually changing. And the change continues. Within this country, we had the Council of Churches arrangement, and we had local Council of Churches, the Hales-Owen Council of Churches, for example. When we started to recognise that we should be including more churches, and at this stage there were still some churches that were part of it, particularly the Catholic Church, there was a move towards something that we now call Churches Together. Both Churches Together in England, Churches Together in Great Britain and Ireland, and Churches Together in Hales-Owen.
And one of the key differences that we now find is that mission is not just about evangelisation. Mission is about global justice, particularly the work through Christian Aid, which embraces so many different groups and is supported by churches pretty much across the spectrum. We have the Welcome Group at Hales-Owen, which is supporting asylums and refugees. Our very dear friend Ernest Crutchley, along with Anne West, have done some fantastic work there. We've been supporting homeless people through our local Churches Together, and of course the food bank is a key part of that. On a wider field, we've got Christian Aid, as I say, and we have the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. We've got the Disasters Emergency Committee, all working together so that Christian people can share in their mission fully.
So we began this series by talking about the man who said, "Love one another." And the difficulty, and there's some challenging questions that we've got to consider, is how do we overcome the problems? Some of them are very trivial, and it's partly habit. One of the interesting ones, perhaps, is that for a long time, churches that came from the nonconformist end were not very happy with having midnight mass on Christmas Eve. And so the Methodists led the way, and many other churches followed it with a watch night service on New Year's Eve instead. Just making a point, wasn't it? And similarly, nowadays, thankfully, we use things like palm crosses and share them around on Palm Sunday. But there was a time, and I can remember that my mum would have said this, oh, it's a bit too Roman Catholic, or it's a bit too Church of England. But palm crosses have become part of our pattern now. Very trivial things in some ways, and there are other things that need to be overcome. Maybe we've got to learn a lot more about how we could use Lent better. Maybe Advent is a time of year that, as nonconformists, we haven't really understood what our Anglican and Roman Catholic brothers and sisters can teach us.
And then there are the bigger issues linked particularly to baptism, Eucharist and ministry. How somebody joins the church, how we have communion, and who is allowed to lead. And I do believe that we've got to find some very positive ways forward. One way is we have what are called LEPs, local ecumenical projects. You've got churches like the one in Cotteridge where the Congregational Church, the Methodist Church and the Anglican Church all came together. They sold two of the buildings and focused on the Methodist Church, and that is now known as the Cotteridge Church. And there, a lot of these problems are solved, working together in imaginative ways. Certainly that was a place where it would work well, but maybe we have to keep on looking at these things. Another local example of ecumenical working was between St Chad's and the Salvation Army in the middle of Birmingham. Here's the Archbishop of Birmingham, Bernard Longley, to tell us more.
From my kitchen window, I can see the front of St Chad's Sanctuary, which is a joint project between the Catholic Cathedral and the Salvation Army. It's a centre for refugees and asylum seekers. The other day, I just happened to notice a mother with her son, and they were packing their rucksacks with foodstuff. And it reminded me how much the volunteers and the staff have continued to be there for people. It made me really feel I should be doing more actually to help.
And we mustn't forget that we share services regularly with Quinton Methodist Church and with our friends at St Peter's during the year.
Well, let's try and draw all these things together with maybe a bit of a challenge for us all. Firstly, let's ask ourselves, yes, it's very good that we have a week of prayer for Christian unity. What about the other 51 weeks of the year to recognise that we need to work together? And secondly, to remember that one of the things that made the ecumenical movement work effectively was to do with a shared sense of mission. That in 1910 it's been described as a second reformation of the church because it recognised it should be getting on with sharing in the ministry of Christ, taking on board the mission of what we were to do. And maybe the third thing that fires all of that is to go back to the way we started, with a man on the cross who said, love one another. And if we love one another, then working together, acknowledging differences, but working with them, maybe we can proclaim God's love in word and deed as we work together. Thank you for being part of this. Take care of yourselves. God bless you. Bye-bye now.